Good. So the first thing we're going to go through is just the setup of Cashbook. I'm not going to go through the installation, etc., because the installation is pretty simple. You just run the install file and it will install the Cashbook program files in your Sage 300 program files directory, and it will create a CB followed by the version number, and it will copy all your Cashbook program files in there, as is the case with any of your Sage 300 modules. And then, of course, it's just a matter of activating through administrative services, data activation, activating the Cashbook, and then the Cashbook icons will appear on your desktop, as you can see right now in front of you. The next thing you have to do is you have to ensure that you've set up all your bank accounts in bank services. Now, Cashbook completely replaces bank services. So all your processing for any of your bank entries is going to take place in Cashbook. You're not going to be entering anything in bank services if you use Cashbook. But we do use the banks in bank services to get, if it's a multi-currency company, the bank statement currency of the bank, we then retrieve from bank services for that bank. Also, if you make the bank inactive in bank services, we will also read that inactive flag for your bank in Cashbook. So the bank is also inactive in Cashbook. And then if you're doing accounts receivable and accounts payable entries, when you do reversal in Cashbook, it will call the reversal function in bank services to locate that particular accounts payable or accounts receivable entry, and then to reverse that entry through to the customer account in accounts receivable and the vendor account in accounts payable, and to then reinstate the invoices that that payment or receipt was allocated against. So that's why you have to set up the banks in bank services, because we use it for those three reasons. Other than that, all your processing will take place in Cashbook. Now, once you've set up your banks in bank services, you can then proceed to CB Setup, and you can run the Setup Wizard. Now, this Setup Wizard, what it will do for you is it will take all the information of the bank in bank services, and it will create those same banks that you've created in bank services. It will create it automatically in Cashbook for you. This is purely to make it easier for you, so you don't have to go and create each of these banks in Cashbook yourself. So you can run it initially after you set up all your bank services banks. If you're adding more bank accounts afterwards, you can then add the bank accounts in bank services, and you can run this wizard again, and it will then add any new bank accounts that you might have added since the first time you ran this wizard. It will then add those to Cashbook as well. When you run this wizard, and we can run it now quickly, I can just show you. There will be a message at the end, and it's obviously added nothing for me because they're already there for our purposes, but it will return a message for you as well to say, use the Cashbook options functions to customize the default tax script created by this wizard. And then it will also tell you to use the bank account maintenance function to customize the bank accounts created by the wizard. Why it tells you that is, although it will create all the banks for you that are in bank service, it will create it in Cashbook, there are additional fields that are in the Cashbook bank accounts table that you have to go and enter, that it could not retrieve by the setup wizard from your bank services, because bank services doesn't have all those additional fields that Cashbook requires. So then once you've run the setup wizard, you can then proceed to your bank accounts here, CB Setup Bank Accounts, and you can then go and add all those additional fields. Now, typically you will see that the address fields are already populated with what was in bank services. Yeah, you've got to make sure that you've got a bank account number. That's your actual bank account number that you have with the bank for that particular bank account. So whatever your bank account number is with your bank, you would then enter in that bank account number field. Your source ledger here, Sage 300 GL source, that is the source ledger that you want to assign to Cashbook for your GL entries. So for this particular bank account, if we transfer the entries to GL, it is going to transfer to GL and create those entries with a GL-CB source ledger. Okay, so that is the source ledger for this particular bank account, and that is the source ledger 2-digit identification that it will use for all the Cashbook transactions that come from Cashbook for this particular bank code in GL. Now, of course, if you want to differentiate for your Cashbook entries by bank account, then you would enter a different GL source here for each of your bank accounts in Cashbook. If you want to just have all your Cashbook entries just using CB, because it's a subledger Cashbook, then you would enter CB for all your bank accounts in Cashbook. So it's completely up to you if you want to identify the particular bank account in Cashbook, or if you just want to identify that it is Cashbook entries coming from whichever bank account in Cashbook. Then you would just put CB for all of them. Otherwise, you differentiate between the bank accounts by putting a different 2-digit GL source in there for each of your bank accounts in the Cashbook. I just want to go to CTAC while we're setting this up, because CTAC is the bank we use for our sample data mostly. Good, so there we're back. Use default source code in batch entry. If you toggle that option on, it will give you a default source code field. Now, you would only use this if you have, for this particular bank account, if you have a source code that is most often used for this bank account. In other words, when you create the batch entry for this account in Cashbook, if you wanted to default automatically as you add the batch entry detail line to use the source code and automatically populate the source code field with a particular source code, then you can enter your source code here in the default source code field by selecting the use default source code in batch entry tick box. And that's obviously by bank as well. Everything we do in the CB bank accounts will be per bank. Okay, so if you want to use it, if you don't, untick it, and then it will create a blank source code field in your batch entry detail line, and you can then enter the source code yourself. Else, default it on and enter the source code there that you want to use. The void check source. When you do void checks, now when would you do void checks? Void checks you'll usually do if you're printing checks from Cashbook, and you might be testing your specification that you've set up for either your checks or your receipts. And when you test that your checks are printing correctly on your pre-formatted stationery that you've got for your company, it might have your company logo on, etc., then you would void those checks that you've printed, because it's just a test run to see if the alignment is in if you're posting. Now, all those entries, because it's a check, it has to issue a check number and then void the check number. This source code that you enter here is the source code it's going to use when you void the checks. So that if you ever want to see any of your check number range that has been voided, you can then print all the checks for source code VD, which is void check, and it will then print all the void checks for you. So that's what that void check source code is for. Your next deposit number. So in Cashbook, and when we get to batch entry, I will show you how we do that. In Cashbook, we allow you to set your batch as a deposit batch. Now, when you set your batch as a deposit batch, it will take all the entries in that deposit batch, and it will post all those entries through as one entry for the entire batch, with the total amount of the batch as that entry amount. And it will then use the reference that you've entered in your deposit number field as the reference for that entire batch. And this is where the next deposit number comes in. If you want to run a sequence of deposit numbers, you can put your next deposit number in there and your prefix. And then we've also got a single reference batch. Now, the deposit batch, let's go back to that and explain exactly how that works. When you toggle the in batch control, when you toggle it on as a deposit batch, the reason for that is when you do a deposit at the bank, you might have 50 checks that you're depositing on that one deposit slip, and you're now depositing to the bank. When it appears on your bank statement, it's going to appear as one amount and it will be the total of those 50 checks on your deposit slip. Now, of course, to facilitate easy reconciliation to your bank statement, you would want your Cashbook Bank reconciliation to also have only one entry that makes up those 50 receipts with one amount, so that you can easily pick up the amount off your bank statement, and that total amount of that deposit slip is the total amount of your deposit batch, and then you can reconcile the two against each other very easily. With the deposit batches, the restriction on the deposit batch is that it can only be receipt amounts. So it's specifically for deposits. Doesn't take payments or checks into account. It's purely for receipts that's been deposited on the deposit slip, and you want the total amount to appear in your bank reconciliation in Cashbook. But we also have a single reference batch. Now, the single reference batch operates in exactly the same way as a deposit batch. The only difference with a single reference batch is that you can enter deposits and checks. So you can do receipt and payment amounts in the single reference batch. But it's also going to post through the total of the batch with one reference number for that single reference batch to your bank reconciliation in Cashbook. Now, when this becomes very useful is when you do EFT payments. When you do an EFT payment run, a lot of the banks will, as is the case with your deposit slip that's made up of a lot of checks that you've banked for that day, all your receipts make up the total of the deposit slip, they do the same with the EFT. When they do an EFT process run for you, it will appear on your bank statement as one total with the total, or all the EFTs in that particular process run that they've paid the beneficiaries for. And of course, now, exactly the same as deposit slip, to facilitate easy reconciliation, you can then flag your batch as a single reference batch in Cashbook. And when you post that batch, it's going to post through one total with that single reference. And that total can then be easily reconciled against your EFT process run total that is going to appear on your bank statement. So that is your single reference prefix, and in your batch control, you can then enter your single reference number, which we will get to later, but this is the prefix for your single reference batches. The deposit specification, if you are going to be printing deposit slips from Cashbook, you can then select the Browse button here, and you can select the location of where your deposit slip specification, which will be a crystal report that you've designed to print your deposit slip on your company's pre-formatted documentation. You can then select the Browse button, select the deposit slip specification that you want to print, and when you print deposit slips in Cashbook, it will then use this specification report to print those deposit slips for you. If you have an overdraft that you want to enter for this particular bank account, you can enter the overdraft amount here. When you enter the overdraft amount here, you will see in your bank summary, when we're going to look at our bank summary screen where it shows you all the balances of all your bank accounts in Cashbook, it will then show you that overdraft amount as well. So you can see exactly what your overdraft is for that particular bank account. The currency code. Now, if you're running in a multi-currency environment, and if your bank in bank services is flagged as a multi-currency bank, then Cashbook will retrieve the currency code of your bank in bank services to this currency code field. So that's set up in bank services, and Cashbook will retrieve that information and use it for the same bank. You can see these are disabled field exactly for those reasons. If you want to change the currency code, you must go to bank services, bank setup, and change the currency code there, and it will then update the currency code here in your Cashbook bank account. The rate type for your currency, whether it be spot rate or daily average, whatever you might want to select, that's your rate type. And then we get to your send to fields. And these send to fields are the fields that you want to update the other ledgers with when you post your Cashbook batch, and Cashbook generates the entries for your general ledger, accounts receivable, and accounts payable. Now, the Cashbook interfaces to general ledger to update your bank account and your income and expense account on the other side for straight Cashbook entries. It also interfaces to accounts receivable, where you can enter accounts receivable receipts in a Cashbook batch, allocate against the customer, and it will then update the accounts receivable receipt batch. Also, if you enter a Cashbook batch and it's an accounts receivable entry type, and you enter a payment rather than a receipt, it will then update the accounts receivable refund batches for you with that refund you've done to the customer. In accounts payable, it will update the accounts payable payment batch if you're doing allocations against vendors. And of course, in project and job costing as well, you can interface to project and job costing, and that, if you enter your Cashbook entry, will update your cost and charge batches in PJC with your bank entries that you've entered. Now, yeah, you can select for your general ledger, as I said, the one side of the entry, when you enter any entries for a particular bank code in Cashbook, will always go to the general ledger bank account. So what fields do you want to send to that leg of the general ledger entry that updates the general ledger bank account? You can see here, send to GL Bank. So in that GL Bank leg of the transactions in GL, what do you want to update to the GL reference field? Then you can use your drop down here and you can select which Cashbook field you want to update to that GL reference field for the bank leg of the entry. Do you want to use the Cashbook reference check field, description, the miscellaneous name, miscellaneous code, comments, or the audit information? The audit information is which batch number, which batch entry number in the Cashbook, what did the entry originate from, and that will use that audit information then to update to that reference in the general ledger bank leg of the entry. So those are the Cashbook fields to update to that general ledger reference field. To the general ledger description field, you can then select your reference check description, and we've been through the others already, the same Cashbook field, to select which Cashbook field you want to update to the description. You can see we defaulted obviously to the most commonly used. Your reference check will go to reference, description, description, and comments to comments. So in most cases you won't change that, but if the client requires, you can actually select which fields go where. And to your comments field. Exactly the same for your general ledger distribution leg. Now the distribution leg is the other side of the GL entry if it's a Cashbook entry type. One side goes to your bank account, and then your income and expense account that you've entered on the batch entry detail line, you can then decide which fields from Cashbook to update to the reference, description, and comments field of that general ledger distribution leg. Accounts receivable, what do you want to update to the payer field and the description field? And once again, you can select your Cashbook fields there. And then finally, our accounts payable, what you want to update to the payee field and the description field, and you can select your Cashbook fields. Moving on to the next tab, which is our options tab. Under our options tab, we can select duplicate check reference numbers. Now, if you leave that untoggled, you don't select that tick box. What Cashbook will do is when you enter your Cashbook reference check numbers in your batch entry, upon posting the Cashbook batch, it will cycle through the Cashbook posted transaction files. Now the Cashbook posted transaction files are all the Cashbook entries that you've posted to the Cashbook. That will be stored in your Cashbook posted transaction files. And it's those Cashbook posted transaction files that is used to display your Cashbook entries in your bank reconciliation. Now, when the Cashbook batch is posted, it will check for that particular bank code that the check reference numbers, the reference check numbers that you've entered for each of the Cashbook batch entries in that batch, that those reference check numbers don't already exist for that bank code in the Cashbook posted transaction file. If it does already exist and you haven't toggled on this duplicate check reference numbers option, then it will create an error batch for you. And it will, in your posting journal error report, say reference number already exists, duplicate reference check number. That is to prevent any duplicate reference numbers going through to your Cashbook Bank reconciliation. Now, that is in most cases. You will find that your Cashbook clients want to control that no duplicate check reference numbers are posted through to the bank reconciliation. But not in all cases. You might find that a particular client wants to post through entries to the Cashbook that have the same reference check number. If that is the case, you can then toggle on this duplicate check reference numbers. And if you toggle it on, what this actually means is it means that for this particular bank code, when you post the Cashbook batch, don't do the reference number check to check if that reference check number already exists for that bank code in the posted transaction file. Allow the duplicate check reference number to be posted through to the bank rec file. And of course, the same with the duplicate receipt numbers that you can toggle on. For our tax tracking, if you switch on tax tracking for a bank, it means that for this particular bank, you want to do tax calculations for all your Cashbook entries you enter for this particular bank code. And if you then select tax tracking, you can then, after you've obviously set up all your tax information in tax services, you can then select the finder here on tax groups, and this finder will take you to the tax groups that you've set up in tax services to allow you to select which tax group, transaction type, whether it's purchases or sales, and default tax method, whether it's calculate, in other words, calculate the tax for me according to the tax rate set up for my particular tax authority in tax services, or enter means I will enter the tax amount myself. I don't want it to be calculated. I will enter the tax amount that pertains to a particular entry, or tax line, which means this particular entry is a tax entry. So I'm only entering tax. It's not a tax that's calculated on a different GL account code entry as well. It's purely a tax line, which means I'm entering the tax, and it's going to be 100% tax entry. In other words, tax is going to be 100% of the entry amount. These are defaults. So the tax group and transaction type is going to, if you create a Cashbook batch for CTAC, it is going to default to the information you've selected here. And then your default tax method in that would be in your Cashbook entry detail line. Whatever you have selected here, it will then default to either calculate, enter, or tax line. And then you can also select your default tax authority. So whenever you create a batch for CTAC, it will use this as the default tax information in the bank. And you can then obviously overwrite it if you want to, but if you set this up correctly, and in most cases for this bank that is used, then the user can just have the fields automatically populated with what you've selected here for your tax tracking. If you switch tax tracking off, it means no tax calculations will happen for this bank. There's no tax calculations, any entries posted through for this particular bank code. Then we also have at the bottom here default clearing range, history transactions for, and that is once you've reconciled all your Cashbook transactions and you decide that perhaps your posted Cashbook transaction file is growing very large and you want to clear your reconciled transactions into history because you've kept a lot of transactions now for many years and you no longer need them in your posted transaction file, but you'd like to keep them so you can still refer back to them. You can then update them to your history file. And this is just how many days of your clearing date that you selected. Because when you clear your reconciled transactions in Cashbook, you can clear up to a certain date. This is how many days after that clear until date do you want to keep before you update to your history file. And then your AR/AP interface, allow auto allocation. If you select allow auto allocation, what that means is when you do your allocation of your Cashbook entry that is now an accounts payable or an accounts receivable entry type, when you allocate against the customer or vendor account, if you select this allow auto allocation in the allocation form in batch entry, you can say auto allocate. And what it will do is it will then start allocating from the first outstanding document in that customer or vendor account, and it will allocate until it's depleted the Cashbook entry amount. So it will auto allocate from the first outstanding document and keep allocating until it's depleted the Cashbook entry amount. If you select allow auto allocate, then you'll see another tick box pop up, and that is include discounts. So if you toggle on the include discounts, as it does the auto allocation for each of those documents that's outstanding for that customer or vendor account, if there is a discount that can be realized if you pay by a certain due date, and if you've met that due date and that discount now applies, it will then take the discounts into account. In other words, if I've got an invoice for 100 and I've got a discount of 20 if I pay by the 9th of May 2019, it will then realize that discount for me, and for that 100 that the document is outstanding for, it will only allocate 80 of the Cashbook entry amount to that document, and the remaining 20 would be the discount that it realized because there was a 20 discount on that 100 if we met the due date. So include discounts means realize the discounts, don't allocate the full outstanding invoice amount, but allocate the invoice amount minus the discount because we're taking that discount into account. Keep allocations. Now when you post your Cashbook batches and they have accounts payable and accounts receivable entries, it will post through to the Cashbook posted transaction file. It will post through, and you can then drill down from your Cashbook bank reconciliation back to your Cashbook batch that it originated from. But in your Cashbook posted transaction tables, if you want to keep the allocation details, in other words, the allocation details would be the particular documents that you've allocated your accounts payable or accounts receivable entry against. So if I've allocated against 5 documents for a particular customer, and I want to update that to my posted transaction file in Cashbook, when that accounts receivable entry is posted to the posted transaction file, so that I can see in my posted transaction file exactly which invoices I've allocated against for that particular customer, then I will toggle on keep allocations. Now, a lot of clients might not want to keep allocations because obviously, if you keep allocations, you are storing more information in your Cashbook posted transaction file, so the file will be bigger if you keep your allocations than it would be if you didn't select it. So if you don't need it, leave it off. But if they do want that information in the Cashbook posted transaction file on which documents in AR and AP this particular entry was allocated against, then switch on your keep allocations and it will update those fields in your posted transaction file. Then we're moving along to the Accounts tab. And this Accounts tab is where you would set up your GL accounts for this particular bank code in Cashbook. Your first one is your GL bank account for this particular Cashbook bank. Okay. So that is your bank account in GL for this bank. So whenever you post any entry in Cashbook for this bank code, it will update the bank leg of the entry in GL to this account. So this would always be the account that is updated on the other side of the distribution leg of the GL account. Void checks. Remember, we had that void checks source code that we entered. This is the account that we would use if you void a check to update those 0 amount check numbers to that was voided. So just enter your void checks number there in GL, and you can always go and check it in GL, but it will always be 0 because it's just to account for those check numbers that were voided so that your check register is still in sync and every check number is accounted for. Okay, so that's what we will update those 0 amount entries of the void checks to. Then we go to use clearing accounts. Now you can toggle it on or off. For our purposes, I would be very, very surprised if any of your clients do not want to use clearing accounts. We added this on a request from Indonesia. We've got a big client in Indonesia, a reseller in Indonesia, and their clients didn't want to reconcile their clearing accounts. So we gave them the option to either use the clearing accounts or not. Now, it will default to on use clearing accounts because in most cases you want to use your clearing accounts because your clearing accounts is very useful to ensure that your transaction flow is being completed. So what happens with the clearing account is we've got to, first of all, let's go to our bank transfer clearing account. We've got a bank transfer clearing account. Now, why do we have a bank transfer clearing account? Because when you do bank transfer batches in Cashbook, and you can see when we get to the Cashbook batch, we will go through that, but you can select your batch to be either a normal batch or a transfer batch. If your batch is a transfer batch, we allow you to transfer funds from one Cashbook bank code to another Cashbook bank code. But we need a clearing account because if I am transferring funds, say for bank code CTAC to bank code CCB, what will happen in bank code CTAC, I will enter my transfer amount, which will be a payment because I'm transferring from this bank. So my funds are moving from this bank. So this bank account, a payment would be put through to this bank account because I'm transferring funds from this bank account. The opposite side of the entry will go to my bank transfer clearing account. When you post the bank transfer batch, it will then create a batch for the bank code that you're transferring to. In other words, CCB, because we're transferring the funds from CTAC to CCB. And when it generates that batch in CCB, it is going to update CCB with the receipt amount to the bank account for CCB because it's receiving the funds now. And the opposite side of the entry is going to go to the bank transfers account. So once you've posted your transfer batch from your sending bank and your receiving bank, the net effect is going to be a payment from CTAC to that CTAC bank account, a receipt to CCB for the CCB bank account, and your bank transfers is going to zero balance because it's going to have an entry on the credit side and an entry on the debit side. From your sending bank, when you posted the batch, it will update your bank transfers account on the one side, and on your receiving bank, it will update the bank transfer account on the other side. So if you wanted to reconcile your bank transfers account, you can go to GL, look at your bank transfers account, and if it is a zero balance for that account, in other words, all the credits and all the debits balance to each other to make it a zero balance, then you know that all the transfer batches that you've created in your sending bank has been posted in your receiving bank. Of course, if you have a balance there in that bank transfer account, it means that those bank transfers that you've created from the sending bank might still be sitting unposted in your Cashbook batch list, and therefore they have not been posted on the receiving bank side. And that is why you still got a balance there, because only when you post them will the opposite side of the entry be updated to the bank transfers clearing account. So the transaction flow there for the bank transfers is to ensure that all your bank transfers that you've created in your sending banks have been posted to your receiving banks. And if your bank transfer account is zero, then that particular clearing account tells you that that transaction flow has taken place. The bank transfer has been created in the sending bank and it has been posted to the receiving bank. Now, for your accounts receivable and accounts payable clearing accounts, and these should always be the same, accounts receivable and accounts payable. Let me explain why they should be the same and why we give you two fields. There's only one bank account in bank services when you set up your bank account in bank services. Now, when you post your accounts receivable and accounts payable entries, it will update that one bank account in bank services. Therefore, your accounts receivable bank clearing account in this field and your accounts payable bank clearing account should always be the same. So they should both be 1080 if you choose 1080 as your clearing account. The only reason we give you two fields there is because you might have a client that's only running accounts payable or only running accounts receivable. So if they're only running accounts receivable, only running accounts payable, then you want to enter your clearing account only for AR or AP. If they're running both, you must enter the same clearing account. Now, how does this work? When you enter the clearing account here, and for an accounts receivable and accounts payable entry in Cashbook, you post the Cashbook batch. It's going to update your bank account, of course, as always, to the bank account for that Cashbook bank code in GL, and it's going to update the accounts receivable and accounts payable clearing account on the other side. When the Cashbook batches are then generated in accounts receivable and accounts payable, when you post those Cashbook batches in accounts receivable and accounts payable, this clearing account will be updated on the other side. So from the Cashbook side, it will update the Cashbook to the accounts receivable, accounts payable clearing account, and when you post it batches in accounts payable and accounts receivable, it will update the opposite side of your accounts receivable and accounts payable clearing account. Why? Because when you set up your bank code in bank services, you must not use your GL bank account for that particular bank code in bank services. What you must enter there is your accounts receivable and accounts payable bank clearing account. Why? Because when you post your accounts receivable receipt and refund batches and your accounts payable payment batches, it updates bank services. So it's going to update your AP control and your AR control on the one side, and it's going to update your bank services bank account on the other side of the entry. And that bank services bank account, because you've entered your clearing account and not your actual bank account in your bank services bank account field for general ledger, it will update the clearing account. Now, when you look at your clearing accounts, of course, when you get to your general ledger, you want to make sure that those clearing accounts also balance out to zero. And if they don't balance out to zero, what that means and what that tells you is that you've posted some Cashbook batches that have accounts receivable, accounts payable entries in them, but those batches that were generated to accounts receivable, accounts payable are still sitting there unposted. And that's why your clearing account is not balancing to zero. As soon as you post those batches, then it will update bank services. And because your bank services account is your clearing account, the opposite side of the leg of the clearing account will be updated, and you should have a zero amount. And that's why you now understand when I say that most clients value their clearing account as a reconciliation tool to make sure that the transaction flow is complete. In other words, that all the Cashbook batches for AR and AP that was posted was actually posted in accounts payable and accounts receivable as well. And we can tell this because our clearing account balances to zero. Okay, so that's how your clearing accounts work. Payroll, you can ignore. That is the payroll for our North American clients. We have a US and Canadian payroll that we interface to Cashbook, so it doesn't apply to your South African clients. Use clearing account for project and job costing. If you are interfacing to project and job costing, you can also enter a clearing account for your project and job costing. Then we move along to the Forms tab. Now in the Forms tab, you can set up a location, a description for your location, and the location could be many branches, for instance, if you're printing checks or receipts from different branches, and you have different check receipt number sequences for the different branches. Then you can set up a location, you can call it one, you can say depot, whatever this might be, just making it up, next check number, and then you can select what your report style is and advice lines per page, and you can then select this finder here to select your check specification for the checks you are going to be printing from Cashbook. Once again, that check specification will be a crystal report that you would put in a location. You would select the location of that report here. And when you then print your checks in Cashbook for this bank code, it will retrieve that check specification, and according to the layout of that check specification, print on your company's pre-formatted check stationery. Okay, so that's where you enter your check specification at. So when you print your checks and receipts, it will give you the option to select which location you're printing from, and it will know which next check number to allocate to your check when it prints it, and also which specification to use for that check you're printing. And then finally, we've got the security tab. Now the security tab, apart from your security you can set up in your security groups for Cashbook, and you will be familiar with this under Administrative Services Security Groups. As you set up your security access rights for any of your other sub-ledgers in Sage 300, you can also do so for your Cashbook. So you can select Cashbook 65, and then assign a group ID, and then you can select any of your security access rights to the various functions and processes in Cashbook. Okay, so you can still set up your user security access rights. Of course, this is your security group, and then you assign it under user authorizations to a particular user. So you can restrict the security of your users by the functions and processes they allowed access to by selecting which functions and processes you want to allow them access to in your security group. But in addition to that, so that works like any of your other Sage 300 modules. In addition to that, we give you a bank security as well. Let me explain why. If you have a particular bank account that has sensitive information in, like your salaries and wages account would be a good example, you might want your Cashbook user to have access to whatever rights you've assigned to them in the security group for Cashbook. But for this particular bank account, you want to specify which users must have access to this bank account, because this is a salary and wages account, and you only want to allow the salary and wages clerk to be able to have access to this bank account, regardless of the security rights that you've set up under the security group. Now, the way this works is if you then click on Use Security for this bank code, you then have to enter all the users that will have access to this bank code in this grid down here. So you can select your user ID, and if the user is entered in this grid here, they will then have access to the bank account. If they're not entered in this grid, they will not see any of the batches for that particular bank code. They will not see any of the balances. They won't be able to access the bank reconciliation for that particular bank code. It blocks them out of all information for this particular bank code, so that they cannot see anything related to this bank code unless they are entered as a user in this bank security grid. So that is your bank security. Of course, your username, and of course we allow you, because you now have a particular user you're allocating access to for this bank code, if you want this to be the default bank for that particular user, then you can say yes in this default bank, and it will then default to this bank code for that particular user. If you want to use a password, you can then put a password on as well. And we've also added fields here if you want a minimum functional amount and maximum functional amount to restrict the user by. You can then enter those amounts here. So let me quickly explain this. If you have a minimum functional amount, and because we work in a multi-currency environment, it's always the functional amount. So not the bank statement currency amount, but the functional amount. You can then enter a minimum functional amount, which means that the user cannot enter any entries in this bank code that are less than this minimum functional amount. And if you select a maximum functional amount, you enter an amount in there, a value in there, the user will not be able to enter any Cashbook entries that exceeds that amount that you've got as the maximum functional amount. And that then is your bank account setup. So now that your bank accounts are set up, we can now move on to our next fields that we want to set up under our Cashbook setup. Now, the first place we're going to go to after we've set up all our bank accounts now is we're going to go to Options. Now, under Options, whatever you set up in Options is a global setup. Remember, we were now in bank accounts. So whatever we set up in the bank accounts only apply to that particular bank code that we selected in bank accounts. But if you want to do any global settings across your bank codes in Cashbook, this is where you're going to see the options, and this applies to all the bank codes in your Cashbook. On the General Options tab, we have a check for duplicate checks. Now, the check for duplicate checks, you will remember I said that if you don't have duplicate check reference number selected for the bank code in bank account setup, it will, at posting, verify and check that that particular reference check number doesn't already exist for the bank code in the Cashbook posted transaction file before it posts the entry through. If it does, it creates an error batch and it gives you an error in the posting journal error report. Now, we allow you to check for the duplicate checks at batch level, not at posting level. The reason we did that was the request was from the users to say, that's all good and well. We don't want duplicate checks to go through to our bank account. But we're now sitting with error batches where it's now taken that entry out of the batch and it's created an error batch with that entry, and we're sitting with a posting journal error report, and now we have to fix that and repost it. We'd far rather have that verification done on whether the reference check number already exists for that bank code at batch level, so that we don't end up with an error batch and a batch posting journal error report. Then you can set it at batch level. Check for duplicate checks none. In other words, don't check for duplicate checks. It will default to none. It will then check at posting for you. But if you want to check at batch level, you can set a warning message. And it will then check the posted transaction file for you and any unposted Cashbook batches and warn you that there is a reference check number for that bank code that already exists. That is the same as the reference check number of that entry you're just entering at the time. Now, warning will give you the message, but it will still allow you to continue and enter that reference check number. And then, of course, at posting, it will create a error batch and give you a posting journal error report entry. Error means don't just warn me. Prevent the user from actually continuing until they enter a reference check number that does not exist for that bank code in unposted batches or in the Cashbook posted transaction file. So that will force the user to put a unique reference check number for that bank code in the batch before they continue and save the batch entry. No blanks. If you leave the reference check number field blank, you save the entry and you post, it will once again create an error batch, and in your posting journal error report, it will give you an invalid reference number error because the reference number is blank. Now, if you want to prevent that error batch from being created and your error posting journal being updated, then you can select no blanks, which means when you save the batch entry, it will verify that there is a value in the reference check field and that it's not left blank. And it will not allow you to save that entry until you have a value in the reference check fields. So that's how you prevent blanks from going through in the reference check fields at posting. Default bank code. This is the bank code that you would most often use. So it's your most active, most highly volume transaction bank code in your Cashbook. You can enter as the default bank code. What that means is that when you create a new batch as any user in the Cashbook, it will then default to that bank code. And they can then, if it's not their main account, then override that default bank code with the account that they want to enter the batch for. But in most cases, if it is the main bank account, they don't have to enter the bank code. It will default to the bank code that you've selected here for all the users in the Cashbook. The default tax group. Once again, if you have a default tax group that you want to set, then you would enter your default tax group here that applies to all your bank accounts in Cashbook. And then your default transaction type, purchases or sales. you can enter then what the default transaction type would be. Show warning if batch date not in bank reconciliation date range. If you toggle this option on, what it will do is when you're entering your Cashbook batches, that particular batch entry date that you're entering, it will then check for you whether your bank reconciliation, now in the Cashbook bank reconciliation, and when we get there, we will go through that. You can have a starting date and an ending date in your bank reconciliation to show entries between the current period that you're working for. So in our case, we might want to show it from the 1st of May 2019 to the 31st of May 2019. So that we're only working with that reconciliation for that period. Now, if you toggle this option on, when you enter your batch entry, it will check whether that batch entry date falls within that date range that you've selected in your Cashbook bank reconciliation. And if it does, it will not give you a warning message. However, if the date falls outside that date range of your bank reconciliation, it will then give you a warning message. So this particular batch entry date does not fall within the date range selected in your bank reconciliation. So that you're aware that you are entering entries that falls outside the current date range selected for that bank code in the bank reconciliation. Batch options, confirm batch creation, and this you would be used to from your other Sage 300 modules, same thing. If you want to confirm batch creation, if you toggle it on, when you create a new batch, it will pop up with a message to confirm that you do want to create that batch or not. Force listing of batches, to force the user to print a batch before they can post the batch. So force listing of batches will check that the batch is printed before it can be posted. Edit retrieve batches. The retrieve batches are the batches coming through from accounts receivable and accounts payable. If you post your accounts payable payment batches and your accounts receivable receipt and refund batches, then they're retrieved to the Cashbook. You cannot edit those batches in the Cashbook. So the user goes in there, and that's obvious why, because you might not want them to change those batches, and then they'll be out of sync of the batches that are coming through from accounts receivable and accounts payable because they changed the entries in the Cashbook. But if you want to edit those retrieve batches, there might be a scenario where a particular user wants to add an additional batch entry detail line and enter a bank charge, for example, on that batch entry detail line. So they want to be able to edit those retrieve batches. Then you must toggle on this edit retrieve batches option. Otherwise, they would not be able to edit those retrieve batches. So leave it off, and you control that your users cannot change those batches flowing from accounts receivable and accounts payable. Switch it on, and they have then the ability to go and edit those batches retrieved from accounts payable and accounts receivable. And our integration with other systems tab, we get to GL integration. If you want your GL entries that are entered in the Cashbook to be updated to the general ledger when the Cashbook batches are posted, then you select your during posting. And as the Cashbook batches are posted, your general ledger batches will be generated in general ledger. If, however, you only want to transfer the Cashbook entries to general ledger by using the Create GL Batch icon, which is in our CB periodic processing. You can see here, CB periodic processing, Create GL Batch. You can then select to create your GL batches up to a particular posting sequence. Then you would select on request using Create GL Batch icon. And as you post the Cashbook batches, it will then update the Cashbook general ledger tables with that information, with all those batch entries. And only when you go to the Create GL Batch icon and select up to a particular posting sequence, will it then transfer the entries to the GL, and not every time the batch is posted. Okay, so that's your two choices there. Consolidate GL transactions on transfer. If you select Consolidate GL transactions on transfer, what the Cashbook posting will do when it transfers the batches to general ledger or the Create GL Batch icon is, if you have many transactions going through for the same GL account from the Cashbook, it will then consolidate those entries and only send through one entry, being the net total of the Cashbook entries that updates to that GL account. If you want the entries to go through in their detail, in other words, every entry is posted in the Cashbook to that GL account, then you would not select Consolidate GL Transactions on Transfer. Append GL transactions to an existing batch. If you select that option, it will check when the GL entries are transferred from Cashbook. It will check if there is already an open batch that originated from Cashbook. So if there is a previous Cashbook batch that was updated to General Ledger, and that General Ledger batch is still open, it hasn't been posted, then it will add your next Cashbook entries now coming through for your next transfer. It will add it to that open Cashbook batch that was previously created in the General Ledger and add to that GL batch rather than creating a new GL batch. If you leave it off, it will create a new GL batch every time the Cashbook entries are transferred to GL. Post batches automatically in. So when you enter your Cashbook batches and you're now posting them, do you want to automatically post the batches that are generated to General Ledger, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and of course your job costing, cost and charge batches? If you toggle any of these tick boxes on, any of the entries that are generated to these other subledgers will automatically be posted. So Cashbook will not only post and create those batches in the subledgers, but once those subledger batches have been created from the Cashbook, it will then also call the posting function to post those batches in General Ledger, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and job costing if you've selected these tick boxes. Then finally, under our CB options, our Retrieve from Other Systems tab. Now, Retrieve from, we can now set up, if we want to retrieve our accounts payable payment batches from accounts payable, if we toggle on accounts payable here, and we enter our AP source code there, then every time an accounts payable payment batch is posted in accounts payable, it will automatically generate a batch for you in Cashbook. So it will automatically retrieve that accounts payable payment batch to Cashbook every time it's posted. What Cashbook does is it subclasses the posting in accounts payable and accounts receivable. And as those batches are posted, it automatically generates your Cashbook batches for you if you've selected your Retrieve from Other Accounts Payable tick box and enter your source code for accounts payable. Now the source code you enter here is the source code that would be assigned in the Cashbook batch entry detail line for all the accounts payable entries that are automatically retrieved when the accounts payable payment batch is posted. The same with your accounts receivable. If you want to automatically retrieve from accounts receivable, toggle this on and enter your AR source code that should be assigned to all your AR entries on the batch entry detail line. Order entry, if you toggle order entry on, if you've done in order entry, if you've done a receipt allocation or automatic receipt allocation against your order entry invoice in order entry, and order entry then automatically updates your AR receipt batch with that receipt entry. If you toggle order entry on, Cashbook will then also retrieve entries not only with an AR source application, in other words, it originated in AR, but also for those automatic receipt entries that were allocated in order entry against the invoice. If the source application is order entry, it will then also retrieve those receipts with the OE source application into Cashbook if you select the order entry tick box. And then we have an other tick box. And this other tick box are for any other third-party applications that is updating your AR receipt batches. A practical example, and where this is most used, is if you've got a point of sale system. If you've got a point of sale system that interfaces to Sage 300, And that point of sale system is creating receipt batches in accounts receivable for you. That source application of that point of sale system, whatever that point of sale system is, might be. Okay, in South Africa, we've got a point of sale system called RMS. So the source application for RMS would be RM. You can then toggle on other. You can put in the source application RM here, and any of those batches that were updated from your point of sale system to your accounts receivable receipt batches with a source application of RM will then be retrieved to the Cashbook. Now what this does is it gives the user the ability to either retrieve their point of sale system receipt batches to Cashbook or not, which is important because some point of sale sites want the receipt batches that are generated in accounts receivable to flow through to their Cashbook so they can reconcile those entries in their Cashbook bank reconciliation. Others might do a different transaction flow, and they do not want those point of sale systems to be automatically flowing through to Cashbook from their AR receipt batches. And in that case, you would then not select other and not enter the source application there. If you do enter the source application, it will then automatically retrieve. And again, the payroll source code would only be for our North American clients for their payroll interface. APAR options. Under APAR options, let's go to AP options first. For those accounts payable payment batches that are now automatically going to be retrieved from accounts payable because we've set it up as accounts payable and we've entered the source code here, do you want to create a single reference batch for each of those accounts payable payment batches that are retrieved to Cashbook? Now, when would you do that? Let's say you've done a payment run in accounts payable. It's an EFT run because you don't do checks anymore. You do all your EFT processing through your bank. And that payment run for that particular batch that is now coming through to Cashbook, you want to create a single reference batch every time because your bank on your bank statement will only reflect the total of your EFT run for that total EFT run, and therefore you want to post through a total for the single reference batch of all those EFT entries to facilitate easy reconciliation to the bank statement. Then you can select this create single reference batch. It will then every time an accounts payable batch is retrieved to Cashbook, it will automatically switch on the single reference flag in the Cashbook batch so that all the AP batches flowing from accounts payable will be single reference batches. If you leave it off, it won't toggle on the single reference and it will just create a normal Cashbook batch where all the entries will be posted through as individual entries to the bank reconciliation. And of course, if you don't toggle it on, then you can go into your individual accounts payable payment batches that were retrieved and select to flag those individual batches as single reference batches, if you so wish. Exclude void checks. So exclude void checks is when this accounts receivable batches are retrieved from accounts payable. Do you want to exclude the void checks? Because the void checks are zero checks. So you might not want to have all those void checks that are zero amount checks to come through to your Cashbook. If you don't, then exclude void checks. Exclude alignment checks, same thing. Those alignment checks that you've used to print to ensure that your alignment is in for your check printing, you can then exclude them as well from coming through to the Cashbook because they would also be zero amount entries. Set AP ready to post. If you want to automatically flag the batches that are retrieved from accounts payable to Cashbook as ready to post, then you can toggle that on. And it then saves the user from having to go and set the batches that have been retrieved from accounts payable as ready to post because they would already be flagged ready to post once they've been retrieved automatically from accounts payable. EFT batch, if you're running EFT Express with Cashbook, you can then select to create an EFT batch for each of your accounts payable payment batches that are flowing from accounts payable. So if you're using EFT Express and all your accounts payable payment batches are EFT batches, you might want to toggle that on so the user doesn't have to go and switch on the EFT flag for each of the batches. If you leave it off, It won't flag it as EFT, and then you can go and flag the individual batches yourself as EFT batches, because you might have other entries flowing through from accounts payable that aren't EFT entries. And then finally, under our AP options, we have the append EFT batches. If you select append EFT batches, when it flags the entries as EFT entries from accounts payable, it will check if there is already an open EFT batch in your Cashbook batch list. So in other words, it checks in the Cashbook batch list if there's an EFT batch that has not been posted. If there is, it will then append the accounts payable entries to that open batch rather than creating a new EFT batch in Cashbook. Why is that important? Because you might have many batches in accounts payable that are coming through to Cashbook that you want to do one EFT payment run for. Now, for each EFT batch that you post in Cashbook, it will generate an EFT file. So if you want multiple accounts payable payment batches to be generated to one EFT file in EFT Express, then you would append EFT batches. You would then leave that batch unposted until all the accounts payable payment batches for that particular EFT process run has been updated to that same Cashbook batch. You can then post that Cashbook EFT batch and it will generate one EFT file for you to upload to your bank. Of course, if you don't select that option, it will just flag the batch as EFT and it will create a new EFT batch every time you post an accounts payable payment batch. And of course, that means that each batch coming from accounts payable, if it's a separate Cashbook batch that's created for EFT, will have a separate EFT file that is created every time the batch is posted to upload to the bank. Under our AR options, we can create a deposit batch exactly the same as we create single reference batch. So every time a receipt batch is retrieved from accounts receivable, do you want to flag it as a deposit batch or not? Set ready to post, do you want to set the receipt batches as automatically ready to post when they're retrieved to Cashbook? And the refunds as EFT batches. If there are any accounts receivable refund batches that are retrieved to Cashbook, do you want to flag them as EFT batches? Because your refunds that you're doing to your customer, you might also do via EFT. If that is the case, you can automatically flag all the refunds coming from accounts receivable to cash as an EFT batch to generate that EFT file for your refunds to be processed. And that is our Cashbook options completed. So to get back to our CB setup, our GL accounts icon, that is purely, and that's why that's very seldomly used, if you do not have a general ledger for Sage 300 active in your Sage 300 company and you want to set up GL accounts in your Cashbook for your particular company. Now, if you're running a GL, then it will tell you account maintenance is not available. You must use Sage 300 GL account maintenance. So that's if a GL is activated for the company. If a GL is not activated for the company, you can then set up your own GL accounts here in Cashbook to use for your batch entries. Next, we move on to source codes. So these are the source codes you would set up in your Cashbook. And of course, every Cashbook entry that you enter will have a source code on the batch entry detail line assigned to that batch entry detail line. To create a new source code, you would create the new icon here, select the new icon. It will then allow you to enter your source code description. If you want to assign a default description for the source code, in other words, every time you select this particular source code, you have the same description that you're going to be using, and you want to save the user from entering that description every time, you can then enter the description here, and this description value that you enter here will then automatically, when you select the source code, be populated to the batch entry detail line description field. If you have a particular GL account, you can then enter the GL account there. If for the source code you have a amount that you want to default to every time that that source code is selected on the batch entry design. You can enter a default amount there, and of course your comments field as well. If you have a default comment you want to assign to the batch entry design comment field. Then for your tax defaults, you can also for that source code select whether your default transaction type should be sales or purchases for that particular source code, and your tax authority and tax class, and whether tax is included or not for that source code. So you can set up all those defaults. If you then select the source code, it will automatically populate your batch entry detail with all the defaults that you've set up here for your source code defaults. Then distribution sets. We allow you to enter distribution sets in Cashbook, whereby you can then set up a distribution set. Our example here is rent. We might want to set up a distribution set for our landlord, and in our distribution set for our landlord payment for our rent every month, we might have multiple detail lines that if we select a distribution code for rent, we want populated automatically to our batch entry details for that particular batch entry that we selected the distribution code for. Now for your landlord, you might have parking fees that you're paying. You're also paying them for domestic cleaning services because they are coming in and cleaning the offices, and then your rent for your office space. But you want those to go to different GL accounts because your parking has got a separate GL account, your cleaning services, and of course your office rental. You can then set it up all as detail lines within the distribution set with the GL account and the amount that should be populated to the detail field, and of course all your tax information and comment as well at the end there. And when you select this distribution code in your Cashbook batch entry header, it will automatically populate your batch entry detail lines with the lines that you've set up in this distribution set. Of course, the way you can select your distribution method to calculate the individual lines within the distribution set is you can either have a fixed amount, and you can enter each entry's detail amount in the amount field of the detail lines, and then it will show you the total distribution amount there for all the amounts that have been added to this distribution set. If you want a fixed percentage, you can then also enter a total distribution amount here, and you can then on each of your distribution set lines, you can enter your distribution percentage on how you want this total distribution amount to be distributed according to the percentages that you've set up for your individual distribution set lines. And depending on your total distribution amount and your percentage, it will then take the total distribution amount according to the percentage you've set up here in your distribution percentage. It will then calculate the detail line amount. So if you've got 100 there and 20% goes to the first line, 40% to the second line, and the remaining 40% to the third line, it will use those percentages, calculate what the total discount amount percentage is that you've selected, and populate your amount fields. And then finally, your last option is spread evenly. In other words, whichever those total distribution amount I enter here, spread it evenly across my detail lines. So if once again my total distribution amount is 100, it would then spread it evenly as 33.33333 for each distribution line, because I've got 3 distribution lines. So it will spread the total amount evenly across the amount of distribution set detail lines that you have. And that obviously is very useful if you have an entry with multiple detail lines that is recurring every time, and you don't want to have to enter all the detail lines for that recurring entry. You can set up a distribution set and it will automatically populate those entry detail lines for you when you select that distribution set in your Cashbook batch entry. And the miscellaneous codes, you can set up miscellaneous codes that you might want to use in your Cashbook. So if it's not an accounts receivable or an accounts payable entry where you're allocating against a vendor or a customer, you might still want to allocate a miscellaneous code to the batch entry detail for your Cashbook entry types. If that is the case, you can then enter your miscellaneous code address details under the address tab, and we won't go through that. Those are self-explanatory fields. You can enter all your address details for your miscellaneous code. Under options, you can also attach a distribution code to a miscellaneous code. So for my landlord, for instance, let's get back to our landlord. And if we've created a miscellaneous code for our landlord, and we want that rent distribution code to be automatically populated to the distribution code field when we select our miscellaneous code for the landlord, then we would enter that rent distribution code here in this field, and it will automatically select that distribution code for us when we enter that miscellaneous code in the batch. It will then automatically retrieve the distribution code for you. Your currency code, if you've got a currency code for that particular miscellaneous code in a multi-currency environment, and your rate type you can then set up as the currency code and rate type for your miscellaneous code. Under banks, we allow you to enter bank account information. So you can enter the bank account name and account number for that miscellaneous code. And when that is also very useful is, for instance, if you have bank account details that you want to print on your receipts or your deposit slips, you can then enter miscellaneous code, enter the bank account name and account number there, and you can then use those fields when you set up your specification for your receipts or your deposits to use that bank account name and account number if you want to put the bank account name and account number on the actual receipt or deposit slip that you're printing. You can enter it here and you can use these fields on your specification file that you set up. When you enter miscellaneous code here, it will check in accounts payable and accounts receivable if there is a vendor code or a customer code that exists with that same number. So if your miscellaneous code number corresponds to a vendor or a customer code in accounts payable or accounts receivable, it will then automatically retrieve the information set up in accounts payable and accounts receivable, like the address information, to this miscellaneous code. And then finally, we have the EFT tab. And that is if you're running EFT Express, this is where you would set up your beneficiary information for your EFT process run. So the way it works in EFT Express, and I won't go full on into EFT Express training here, but your miscellaneous code must correspond to your accounts payable vendor. And when that accounts payable batch is retrieved to Cashbook as the EFT batch, it will then take the vendor code for that EFT batch. It will then look for the same code under miscellaneous codes as that vendor code, and it will use the EFT beneficiary payment information for the miscellaneous code that corresponds to that vendor code to pick up the beneficiary payment information that you set up on this EFT tab when it generates the EFT payment batch for you when that EFT batch is posted in Cashbook. We've already dealt with the setup wizard. Then we also have our optional fields. Unlike bank services, Cashbook fully supports optional fields on the batch header and batch detail level. So you can set up optional fields for your Cashbook batch header and your Cashbook batch detail. And in your Cashbook batch entry, you can then select these batch header and batch detail optional fields. And when you post the Cashbook batch, the detail optional fields and header optional fields will be updated to the batch generated in accounts payable, in accounts receivable, and in general ledger for that Cashbook batch, because you've set up optional fields in the Cashbook batch. Under our license activation, now under license activation, this is where you would go to update your Cashbook license files and to check for any Cashbook hotfixes. So when you go to CB Setup License Activation, you can see here, it will show you exactly which products you have registered for Peresoft. For our purposes, we've got Cashbook, Rec Express, and EFT Express registered. It will tell you when your software assurance license expiry is. So there's your date for your software assurance license expiry. The first time when you've activated Cashbook and you have now registered with Peresoft for this particular client, you will then come in here, enter your client ID and your company name that you received for Peresoft for that client. And once you've entered your client ID and company name, you can then select your obtain licenses from Peresoft.com function. What that function will do is it will then link to the Peresoft server, and it will retrieve all the licenses for that particular client ID and company name. And the way it is controlled, the registration, is the client ID and company name is verified to the Peresoft database on the Peresoft server, and it will then check for that client ID and company name if it can find that exact client ID and company name. If it can, it will then see which products have been licensed and activated for that company, and it will then retrieve the licenses for that particular version and activate the licenses for their Peresoft products. Now, when their software assurance expires, they will be warned a month in advance that their software assurance will be expiring and that they have to renew. Once you've renewed their software assurance with Peresoft, you want to then come and run this obtain licenses from Peresoft.com function again, and it will then access the Peresoft server once again, and it will check for the new renewal dates, for the new software assurance activation date, and it will then update the client's licenses with the new software assurance renewal date. So it will renew their software assurance for another year or 2 years or 3 years, depending on which option they chose when they renewed their software assurance, and the licenses will then be activated up to that particular month and year again. So remember, when you renew the software assurance, if the software assurance expired, Peresoft has updated the software assurance for you, you've been in contact, you've renewed the software assurance, run the obtained licenses, and it will then update your expiry date to your new software assurance expiry date. Under the Users tab, that is the land packs. In other words, the amount of users that have been registered for the Peresoft products for this particular client. And you can then see how many users you have. In our case, we've got a 5-user land pack and a 1-user land pack, and that's why under our maximum users we can see there is a 6 maximum users count at the bottom. The check for product updates. Now the check for product updates, when you run that check for product updates, it will check if there are any new hot fixes since the last time you've loaded the hotfix on the Peresoft server. If there is, it will then update your hotfix number here at the top, and under here, under file history, it will show you exactly which program files were updated and also which folder they were updated to. That's an EFT file, so it went to FT65A, as you can see there. That's a Cashbook file, so it goes to CB65A. And then, of course, it will update the readme.txt for you in the docs directory under CB65A eng, so that you can see what the updates were in that particular hotfix update. So if we open it in the folder there, you can see there's my readme text. And if I open that file, there is all the updates explaining exactly what those hotfixes contain that you've just loaded to the client system. Now, the hotfixes are cumulative, so you don't have to be concerned about loading many hotfixes. All you do is you run the check for product updates function. It will then update the latest hotfix to your client system. In this case, you can see it's hotfix 5 for Cashbook version 2018. And when you see hotfix 5 appearing there, it means that you have all the updates from hotfix 1 through to hotfix 5 loaded for the client. Okay. So that's your check for product updates. That then concludes our license activation. And of course, finally, we have our setup EFT Express Banks. And that is if you're running EFT Express Banks, EFT Express for Cashbook, you can then set up your EFT Express Bank formats here for your particular bank that's going to be doing your EFT run for you when you upload the EFT file. And these bank formats are obviously written for the particular banks, so that when you upload your EFT file, it's in the exact format that the bank's EFT system expects it to be in and requires it to be in to upload that file to the bank so they can process your EFT run for you. So that's your EFT bank setup. Good, now we've set up our Cashbook. We've gone through all the setup tables, and our next step now is going to be to enter a batch. So for that, we're going to go to our Cashbook transactions, and under Cashbook transactions, we will then select the Cashbook batch list. Before we go into batch list, let's just look at the other options we have here under Cashbook transactions. Batch list, batch entry, obviously you would be used to those in any of your subledgers in Sage 300. It's your list of batches, and if you want to enter a batch. Post batches will take you to your post form where you can select to post a range of Cashbook batches. Under checks, receipts, deposit forms, if you're not printing your check or receipt online, by selecting the print button in Cashbook batch entry, because you want to print a range of checks or a range of receipts for many batches, then you go to your checks, receipts, deposit forms, and it will allow you to print your checks, your receipts, and your deposits, and you can select for which bank code, and you can then select your check run according to your batch range for your checks, receipts, and deposits, and print your checks and receipts and deposits that you've entered in those Cashbook batches. And then we have a retrieve from other systems function here. Now, we've already gone through our option setup where we've set up our accounts payable payment batches and accounts receivable or receipt batches to automatically retrieve from accounts payable and accounts receivable. So if you wanted to automatically retrieve every time the batch is posted in accounts receivable and accounts payable, then you would set it up in your Cashbook options to automatically retrieve. But of course, your retrieve from other systems function could still be useful in those scenarios where you're automatically retrieving from accounts payable, accounts receivable, because when you at first create your Cashbook, there might be batches that is already posted in accounts payable and accounts receivable that you want to retrieve through to your Cashbook before you start posting your new batches that would automatically retrieve because your Cashbook is now set up. You can then select your accounts payable, accounts receivable, or accounts receivable refund. You can select your bank range, and you can select which batch numbers in accounts payable, accounts receivable, receipts, and accounts refund you want to retrieve to Cashbook. And Cashbook will check when you use this function, the retrieve function, that those batches don't already exist in Cashbook. If they already exist in Cashbook, it won't retrieve them again. If it's the first time they are being retrieved, that don't exist in Cashbook, it will re-retrieve them. So it's to initially retrieve batches before your Cashbook was set up, if you want to retrieve them in. Or if you don't want to automatically retrieve batches from accounts payable, accounts receivable, then you would not set it up in Cashbook options to automatically retrieve, and you can then use this to retrieve the batches individually, which is obviously not the norm. Most people would automatically retrieve it as they post, but if you have a client that wants to retrieve manually, they can then do it through here. Also, it can be very useful to see if there is a problem with your retrieval. In other words, you've set it up as automatic retrieval. Now you've posted your accounts payable and accounts receivable batches, but they are not retrieved to Cashbook because there might be a security issue that user might not have access to Cashbook batches, so it didn't, or it might be a GL security issue where the account code of the account, say for instance your ARAP bank clearing account, has a GL security on it and the user is not allowed to access that account, then it would prevent that Cashbook batch from being created because the GL security is blocking it. You can then, for those batches that are now already posted in accounts receivable and accounts payable, but did not successfully retrieve to Cashbook, you can then come here to the retrieve from other systems function, and now that you've set up your security correctly, you can then retrieve those batches that weren't automatically retrieved. And now that your security is set up correctly, of course, in future, every time you post those batches in accounts payable and accounts receivable, they will then automatically retrieved. So that's very useful to bear that in mind, that if batches aren't successfully retrieved, you can come and retrieve them here in the retrieve from other systems function. Now let's go to our batch list. This is all our batches in our batch list, and of course, you can access a particular batch number by setting the batch number there. You can show posted and deleted batches. So if you want to show the posted and deleted batches, you will toggle it on. Otherwise, you toggle it off. It will only show you the open batches. You can also sort your batches ascending or descending. If you select descending, the latest Cashbook batch will then be first in your batch list rather than your batch number 1 if you select ascending and running in an ascending sort sequence to your latest batch from your earliest batch. Your default bank code that you've set up in your Cashbook options will always default to this bank field here. But if you want to only display entries for a certain bank account, then you can select a different bank code here. And if you then say show this bank only by toggling it on, it will show only the batches for that particular bank account. So if you've got 100 bank accounts and you only want to display the entries for a particular bank account, you can then select your bank code there and select the show this bank only, and it will only show the batches for that particular bank code that you've selected. Under settings, you can also set up to show post form. Now what that means is when you select any of your batches here and they are ready to post, you can just hit the post button and it will post that batch for you. But if you want to be taken to the Cashbook batch posting form when you select the post button in your Cashbook batch list because you want to post a range of entries, then you can select your show post form, which means that for any batch that you are going to be posting, if you select the post button here, it is going to automatically take you to this post batches form. And you can then select a batch range to post or a bank range to post. And you would then also have access to reconcile transactions on posting. Select none, which means don't reconcile any transactions on posting. All, if you select all, it will reconcile all transactions on posting. So as you post the entries to bank reconciliation, it will automatically reconcile them. Or zero amounts. If you select zero amounts, it will only automatically reconcile entries with zero amounts when the batch is posted through to the Cashbook posted transaction file. So if you want to access that post form because you want to select any of those reconciliation options on posting, or you want to post a bank or batch range, then you can select that show post form and it will take you to the Cashbook batch post form. In our batch entry, our first field would be our batch ID, and you would then select the bank code that you are entering this particular batch for in the Cashbook. So which bank code you're entering the batch for. And we also have our zoom button here that you can select to access the batch control details form. Now in the batch control details form, you can enter a different batch description. It will default to the batch number for that particular batch, but you can overwrite it with your own description, of course, here in the batch control details, or you can do it also on the batch list. If it's an open batch and hasn't been posted, you can double click on the batch description in the batch list and it will also allow you to enter a description there. Your bank code that you're entering particular bank for, the particular batch for, and then under our batch type, we can select it to be either a normal Cashbook batch, a transfer batch, or of course an EFT batch. Now if you select EFT batch, it means that you're running EFT Express, otherwise that option won't be available to you. And when you then post this Cashbook batch, it will generate the EFT file in the particular EFT bank format that you've set up for EFT for that bank code. and you can then upload that EFT file to your bank for EFT processing. If you select transfer batch, you will then see if I save that transfer batch, it will change my batch entry header. And in my batch entry header, I will have a second bank code field. That is the sending bank, so the bank you are transferring from. And because it's a transfer batch, you have this bank code field, and you can then select any of your banks that you are transferring to. Now, when you enter an entry here, it will then automatically transfer the funds from CTAC to CCB, because once you've entered your reference number, etc., if you enter your transfer amount here, it will, when you post this batch, do a payment entry to bank CTAC, the bank you're transferring the funds from, and it will automatically create a batch for bank code CCB with a receipt amount of the amount you've entered here, so that when you post that transfer batch for CCB, it will then receive the funds on the receiving bank side. So that is your transfer batches. Of course, when you go back into your Zoom, if you don't want to do a transfer batch, but you just want to do a normal batch, your batch entry will then return to the normal batch entry header, and it won't have that bank code field there. It will have a miscellaneous code field because our cashbook type is cashbook. Now let's quickly look at our batch entry header. At the top here, you have your bank statement currency. That is the currency for this particular bank code, because your company is a multi-currency company and you have selected your bank in bank services to be a multi-currency bank, and you selected the bank statement currency in bank services. That is the currency you will see there to show you which currency is the bank statement currency for this bank. And then this is the user that we are logged into Sage 300 Company in as, to show which users entering the batch. The required fields, any fields that are required fields, will obviously show you that little asterisk. That's what it shows you there. The asterisk will show you it's a required field. And then you have your number of entries here, your debit and your credit total will be updated as you enter your entries in Cashbook. Your entry number, your date, which you can select from your Sage 300 fiscal calendar, your year period based on the date that you've selected, and then you can also select your print check receipt checkbox. If you select your print check receipt checkbox, it means that for this particular entry, you are going to be printing a check or receipt. And the reference check number will then be allocated to the entry according to your reference number sequence that you've set up for your checks and receipts in your bank account in Cashbook. So if you select print check receipt, you will see that your reference check field becomes disabled, and you can't enter a reference check field here because that reference check will be assigned according to your reference check sequence number that you've set up for the bank code in bank accounts. If you switch it off, then obviously you can enter your own check receipt number here. Then we get to our Cashbook entry type. And this is where Cashbook is such an important ledger in your Sage 300 Company, because all your bank entries can be entered in one batch with one posting journal audit trail, because Cashbook allows you to have a Cashbook entry, which means it's a straight entry to general ledger, where the one leg of the entry goes to your bank account in general ledger, and the other leg of your entry goes to the general ledger account that you've selected here in the Cashbook batch entry detail line. Now, if you select Cashbook, you can then enter a miscellaneous code. Optionally, if you have miscellaneous code set up in Cashbook, then you can enter that miscellaneous code there. It will then retrieve that miscellaneous code information for you with their currency information, etc. And you can then obviously select a distribution set if you want to add a distribution set here. And you can then enter your straight Cashbook entry with your source code and your GL account code that you're going to be updating in general ledger, and your receipt or payment amount for that GL account. And when you're doing a cashbook entry type like that at the end here, you can also say whether it is job related or not. So if this cashbook entry is job related, you can set job related to yes, and you can then select the jobs button here, and it will take you to your contract, project, category, resource, charge code, etc. All your project and job costing fields that you need to enter a cost or charges batch for that particular project in job costing. So if you enter all the information here, when you post the cashbook batch, it will not only update the general ledger, but it will also update your project and job costing, cost or charges batches in project and job costing. Of course, if it is accounts payable or accounts receivable entry, then that information would have already been in your invoice that you've invoiced to your project and job costing contract in job costing. And when you get your allocation form in Cashbook, you can just say it's job related, and it will then allocate against that same project and job costing information for that particular invoice you're allocating against. But if it's a Cashbook entry, you can then directly update your cost and charge batches in job costing. Now, if it's not a Cashbook entry, but it is an accounts payable entry, then you will see that you can enter your vendor code here. And the finder here will take you to all the vendors set up in accounts payable, and you can select a particular vendor in accounts payable there, and it will then retrieve that vendor information. And of course, we can then, let's select a vendor that we know has some outstanding documents, and we can then go through, hit our insert key to enter our line for our AP. There's our accounts payable bank clearing account coming up, and we can now enter a payment amount, select the allocate button, and we can now go and allocate against the outstanding documents in that particular vendor account. And in your select mode, you can either enter select, which means you are going to select the individual invoices you're going to be allocating against, or you can do a prepayment entry, which you can then obviously also allocate against a particular document. And if you then post this prepayment entry, you can also go to the apply document mode. And of course, the apply document mode, as it tells us here, must have a receipt or payment amount, and the entry details must not have, because if you do an apply document, it means that it's a zero amount entry, and you are going to be picking up an existing prepayment in that customer or vendor account, or maybe a credit note that you then want to allocate against an invoice. So there is no movement through your bank account. It's just picking up an existing credit note or prepayment that's already been processed through your bank account, and you're allocating it against the invoice. So that's your apply document mode. You can then also do by selecting apply document mode. So you can see exactly the allocation methods you would get in accounts payable and accounts receivable. We allow you those same allocation methods if the user prefers to enter their accounts payable and accounts receivable entries in their cash book rather than in accounts payable or accounts receivable. Now, if we've allocated here against the invoice, you can also do an adjustment, as is the case in your accounts payable and accounts receivable receipt and payment batches, and you can then enter a adjustment against that entry. So you can enter a description, and you can then enter your GL account with your adjustment amount there, and you can do an adjustment against that allocation of that invoice. The only thing to remember here is in accounts payable and accounts receivable, under your options, you must make sure that you're allowed to include adjustments in accounts payable payment and accounts receivable receipt batches. Otherwise, this adjustment option obviously would not be available to you, because Cashbook will have to update the accounts payable receipt and payment batches, and it's only if it is allowed in accounts payable and accounts receivable that we allow you to enter adjustment on the Cashbook side, because Cashbook has to update the accounts receivable receipt and payment batches. Therefore, it has to be allowed on that side for Cashbook to update that adjustment information to the payment and receipt batch. And of course, for your accounts receivable, exactly the same thing. we are going to then select our transaction type as accounts receivable. We will then have a customer number that we can select through our finder of all our customers set up in accounts receivable. And we can then enter our accounts receivable entry and allocate against our outstanding documents for the customer. Now, if you enter a receipt amount here, then it will create a accounts receivable receipt batch and generate this entry to the accounts receivable receipt batch. However, if it's an accounts receivable entry type and you enter a payment amount, it will then generate an accounts receivable refund entry in the accounts receivable refund batch, because you are doing a payment to a customer, which means you are refunding the customer. Also, when you're in accounts payable or accounts receivable, if it's an accounts payable or accounts receivable line, let's quickly allocate this against our customer and accounts receivable. Add that entry. Your first detail line of an accounts receivable and accounts payable entry will always be generated to your accounts receivable and accounts payable batches, but we also allow you to enter a second detail line, and that detail line will then be a straight cashbook entry type detail line again. So that detail line you enter here is not going to be updated to your accounts receivable or accounts payable. It will be updated directly to general ledger. And a typical example would be you might have an AR or AP entry you're allocating against, but you also want to enter a bank charge here. And then you can enter your GL account of your bank charge, and that does not go through to your customer or vendor in accounts payable, accounts receivable. It goes straight to the general ledger. And so the second and subsequent lines in an accounts payable or accounts receivable entry will be updated straight to general ledger, as is the case with a normal cashbook entry type. And the first line of the accounts receivable and accounts payable entry is the only line that will go through to your accounts payable payment batches and accounts receivable receipt and refund batches. Optional fields, as I said, you can also select your optional fields on your detail line or on your header by selecting a optional field. If you select it on the detail line itself, you can select an optional field for each of the individual detail lines that make up the entry. And if you select it from the optional field button at the bottom of the form, or the footer of the form, then that optional field will go through for the header of the entry. And that's our cashbook batch. Now, when we post this cashbook batch, it will update our general ledger batches, it will update our accounts payable payment batches, it will update our accounts receivable receipt and refund batches, and it will update our project and job costing cost and charges batches. And of course, it will also update our cashbook posted transaction file, which is the file used for all our cashbook bank reconciliation entries. Now, once we've posted these batches, as per any of the other modules, you can then obviously print a batch status report, a batch listing report, and when you go to your analysis reports, you can also, your audit reports, you can also print your batch posting journal with your batch posting journal error report, etc. Under your registers, under audit reports, you can also print a check receipt register. That means all the checks and receipts that you have printed for your Cashbook bank account, you can then select to print a register of all those checks and receipts. Retrieve errors, that is if you've set up automatic retrieval from accounts payable and accounts receivable. If there are any errors with accounts payable payment, accounts receivable receipt, and accounts receivable refund batches, when the batches were posted and those batches could not be retrieved to the Cashbook, it will then give you the error in the retrieve errors register to say what the error was. And we have an EFT Bank audit register as well. And the EFT Bank audit register is a report in your CB setup miscellaneous codes, that EFT tab, which we've been through, where you set up the beneficiary payment information for your EFT beneficiaries. This EFT Bank audit report will print for you a report showing any of the information that was changed in that EFT beneficiary payment information. I don't have any entries in here, but what it will do is it will tell you exactly for which bank code, which user made the change to that beneficiary payment information. And this is obviously critical because that's very sensitive information. Anybody could change that beneficiary payment information and make a payment to a different bank account. So you would want to know if anybody made changes to that beneficiary payment information. This will tell you exactly which user made the change, what date it was changed on, what time it was changed on, the bank name, account number, branch, all the EFT payment information for the beneficiary. It will show you what the information was, and it will show you if any change took place. In other words, what the information was changed to. So you have a clear audit register of your beneficiary payment information. Our missing checks register, that is if you want to check in your check sequences. You've got your check sequences running from a certain number, and if there's any check number that is missing for a particular sequence, in other words, it wasn't entered in the cash book, and you want to know about that, then you can select your bank. You can enter a range of reference numbers for your check, and when you print this report, and you can print it from the history table as well, if you've cleared those reconciled transactions already to your history, you can include your history if you wish, and it will then cycle through, and it will check in that check range that you've selected if any of the checks in that range is not in the Cashbook posted transaction file or history file for that bank code. It will then print those numbers for you, so that if you've got a reference number showing in your missing checks report, you know that that particular reference number did not get processed through your Cashbook. So you can easily pick up if there are check numbers missing in your check number range that you've entered that hasn't been entered in the Cashbook. So that's your missing check report. And then, of course, your GL transactions will just be a printout of your Cashbook GL transactions that you are transferring to GL. Now we want to proceed to our Cashbook Bank reconciliation. So select our Cashbook Bank reconciliation, and in our Cashbook Bank reconciliation, the first thing we're going to do is select our particular bank code that we want to call the bank reconciliation up for. So here's our Cashbook Bank reconciliation. Your bank code you enter, and you can of course scroll to the next bank, previous bank, first bank, last bank by using your arrows there. For our purposes, we're going to use the Finder and select CTAC. It will then show you all your posted Cashbook entries for that particular bank code for the date range that you've selected. Now the date range is very important. And how do you select the date range? You either select it here by selecting this little fiscal calendar icon here at the bottom, and it will bring up your date range for you, or you can right click. And if you right click, you can then go to your date range here and select your date range there. Okay. So the date range will allow you to enter a from date and a to date. The from date is the date that you want to display your entries from. So if you're working with a particular period, you would enter the from date, the start of that period, and the to date, the end of that period. Now you can see what I've done here is I am displaying a period for 3 months. I'm displaying from the 1st of October 2020 to the 1st of December 2020. And if you look at the top here, on the right at the top of our form, you can see the balance forward, carried forward, and bank statement balance. Now that balance forward date is my starting date, my from date that I've entered. My carried forward date is my end date, my to date that I've selected. And these balances that you see here are dynamically recalculated based on the dates that you've selected in your date range. So the brought forward balance at the 1st of October 2020 was that balance you see there. The carried forward balance at the end of December 2020 is the balance you see there. And the bank statement balance are all the entries up to our ending date, our to date, that have been reconciled for this particular bank code. In other words, all the entries that have been reconciled up to that date would then be your bank statement date. Now, if I change this date, let's say we want to work only with our October entries and not October to December because we're working on a month-to-month basis. And I hit OK. Can you see? It then automatically recalculated those balances for me. I've now got a brought forward balance on the 1st of October and a carried forward balance at the 31st of October and a bank statement balance of all the entries that have been reconciled in this bank code up to the 31st of October 2020. Now, to do your entries here, you will see that all the entries now are only my October 2020 entries because I've restricted it to that 1 month date range. To reconcile these entries, you can just double click here in the status column. Now, if the entry has been matched in Rec Express, this client is using Rec Express, they've imported a bank statement, and that entry has already been reconciled against in Rec Express, then it will tell you that that entry has already been matched to in Rec Express, and therefore you cannot reconcile it in the cash book because your reconciliation for that entry must take place in Rec Express. But if it was an entry that wasn't reconciled in Rec Express, like this entry here, you can then, by double-clicking or by using your spacebar in the status column, you can automatically reconcile that entry by just clicking there or using your spacebar. Now, as soon as that entry is reconciled, look at our bank statement balance. That entry is unreconciled at the moment. As soon as I then reconcile it, it will automatically update my bank statement balance. So as I'm moving through my bank reconciliation and I am reconciling my entries, I can see my bank statement balance changing, so that when I sit with my actual physical bank statement next to me, if that is the case, I can then see that that running balance on my bank statement corresponds to my bank statement balance at the top there as I continue to reconcile the entries in the cash book. You can also reconcile a range of entries if you don't only want to reconcile the individual entry by right-clicking and selecting Reconcile Range. And then you can reconcile from a certain entry to a certain entry, and the range, you can base that range selection on your reference check field, your date field, if you want to reconcile all entries falling within a certain date range, and your description field. You want to go from a certain description to a certain description. And if you hit reconcile, it will reconcile all the entries in that particular range. Okay, and it will tell you the total amount of entries reconciled. A lot of those entries are Rec Express entries, and that is why it would not reconcile that, because that has to be reconciled from Rec Express. If you drop down this little arrow here, you can also unreconcile a range. So if you've reconciled the range and you're not happy with the outcome of that and you want to unreconcile, then you just click on the Open All Reconciled. And you can see my Reconcile button here changes from Reconcile when I select Open All Reconciled to Unreconciled. And then I can unreconcile that range of entries that I've just reconciled. You can see that particular entry I've reconciled earlier is now unreconciled. And my bank statement balance is updated. You can easily find any entry in your Cashbook Bank reconciliation as well by selecting any of your finders. So if I go here and I want to search for a particular entry, I can either use the search at the top here of my form, or I can right-click and select my search from my right-click menu. You can select which field to search by, if you want to search by reference number, or by date, or by description, or by amount. So you select your field, and then you can select whether it should be equal to that field value, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. Enter your field value you want to search for, and then you can select your starting position as well. Do you want to search from the beginning of your bank reconciliation? In other words, from your from date, your starting date? Do you want to reconcile from search from the end date, in other words, the end of your reconciliation? Or do you want to do it from your current position? You might have got up to a certain point in your bank reconciliation and you want to search from there onwards. So your current position would be whichever entry has the focus on. You can see our focus there is on our miscellaneous cash sales entry, so it will search from there. And then you can select the direction, whether you want to search forwards or backwards. So you're going to be searching to the beginning from where you are, or to the end from where you are. That's your search facility. We can also double click on any of our entries here. And if you double click, it will then bring up your entry information for you and show you all the details of your entry. So it will show you which batch entry that entry originated from, also the batch number, the posting sequence, and the posting entry within that posting sequence, and which user entered that entry. And of course, if you select View CB, you can then drill down to that particular batch entry in the cash book. So that when you're in your reconciliation and you want to look at the actual cash book batch entry in your batch, you don't have to leave the reconciliation, you can drill down to it. If it's an accounts payable, accounts receivable entry, you can also drill down to your accounts receivable receipt or refund batch or accounts payable payment batch. Optional, this is your optional field, so you can see which optional fields are attached to that particular entry, assigned to that entry. Your rates will show you all your multi-currency information for that entry, and you can also then print this information, which will then print only this particular transaction information you see here in a report for you. You can lock and unlock a range. So the lock and unlock a range, what that will do is, depending on the range that you've selected, any entries that have been reconciled, so this is only for reconciled entries, you can then lock those entries in your lock unlock range. And what that means is, if you've done a reconciliation and you've reconciled for a period now, and you do not want any other user to come and fiddle with your reconciliation and tamper with it and undo your reconciliation, you can then lock all those entries in that particular range. And all the reconciled entries will then be changed in the status to a L, which means that entry has been reconciled and it's been locked. And only a user in the security group that you've assigned to the users for Cashbook that have lock, unlock security rights will be able to come and unlock that range that you've locked. So it's a very effective way of controlling, once you've completed your reconciliation, who can actually go and fiddle with the reconciliation or tamper with it. Only users that have lock and unlock rights assigned to them can then go and unlock those reconciled entries and change the reconciliation. Reverse range. Now, for any of these entries, you can right-click and you can then reverse the entries. Now, if you reverse a particular entry, it will check. If it's a Cashbook entry, it will then reverse the entry through to General Ledger. It will create a reversal batch and it will reverse the entry through to General Ledger. If it's an accounts payable or accounts receivable entry, it will check and it will locate that entry in bank services. And it will not only reverse the entry in Cashbook, but it will also reverse the entry in bank services, so that bank services reversal will then reinstate the invoices that that payment or receipt was allocated against. So when you look at the customer or vendor account, you will see that that receipt or that payment was reversed and the invoices will be reinstated because it would reverse through to bank services. Okay. Now, if it's accounts payable, accounts receivable, you'll see in your reversal as well, you can only reverse in Cashbook as well. So if there's a problem with the reversal process in bank services, you can then reverse in Cashbook only. It won't reverse in bank services until you've addressed the issue in bank services. And then you can reverse in bank services for that entry if you want to. Now, the reverse range allows you to select a range, a reference range, or a date range. And then you can populate your reversal grid here, and you can select all on or all off into your reversal reason, and it will then, for all the entries you have selected yes to reverse, it will then reverse those entries. So if you've posted a particular batch, for instance, and you shouldn't have posted a batch, it went to the wrong bank code, you can then reverse a range of entries and reverse that entire batch entry range that you want to reverse. Our sort sequences. Now, you can sort by any of the columns in your bank reconciliation. And the column that you are sorting by will have the little asterisk by. So at the moment, we are sorted by description. You can see the arrows next to description. But if I'm here in the reference check number field and I'm going to sort by reference check, then I would place my focus in the reference check field and hit the sort there, and it will then move the asterisk to my reference check field, and now I'm sorting by my reference check number field. You can do that for any of the fields, date, description, amount. So you select the sort sequence that your bank reconciliation should be sorted in, and you can easily tell just by looking at the asterisk which column you are sorting by. Calculate is just a calculator if you want to use a calculator in your bank reconciliation. And then you can also mark entries. So you can double click here and mark entries if you want to work with particular entries only. And then if you want to show only the marked entries, you can select show marked, and it will then show only those marked entries, or clear mark, it will clear all the entries. So the other options at the bottom here, you can print your Cashbook report or your bank's reconciliation report from here. You can also go to your analysis reports on your Cashbook menus to print it from there, but you can print it directly from here. So if you go to your Cashbook reports, you can then, for this bank code, it's already got the date range that you selected for the bank code, and you can then print, and you can select your reference sequences and date sequences that you want to print that report for. And if you want to print the details, in other words, the entry details of that particular entry, whether you want to print reversals as well, whether you want to print only locked entries, in other words, entries that have only been reconciled and locked, and the currency information if you want to print the bank currency only, or all the currencies in that batch, in other words, all your source currencies in that batch. Whether you want to include the header optional fields, detail optional fields, and the detail tax details for the entry. Now, if you print your Cashbook report, it will then give you a report based on your ranges that you selected, and of course your details that you selected to be included, and it will give you a Cashbook opening balance from the starting date. It will then list all the entries that fall within that range that you've selected, and at the end it will then give you your end entry total there for your Cashbook report. So if we want to go to the end page here, there we can see we've got our Cashbook closing balance. So we've got an opening balance, all the entries in between, and a closing balance. Now, of course, if you print your reconciliation report rather than your Cashbook report, then it will print all the entries in your range that you've selected, but it will not only print from your start date to your end date, it will also print any unreconciled entries that precedes your starting date. Why is that? Because it will show you all the entries that are still unreconciled in your previous periods. So you will see in your reconciliation report, you cannot set your starting date. It will always default to 01/01/1980. You can only set your ending date because it has to print all the unreconciled entries from previous periods, because those are typically the entries you will be reconciling in your current period because they haven't been reconciled as yet. So that's the difference. It will then print a different report with you with all the outstanding entries, all the unreconciled entries before the starting date up to the ending date. So that's the report you can print from here. Of course, that's just your lock unlock. If you want to unlock the range, the same as you would do in your right click. Your search, same as your right click search or your search at the top. You can access it through the little binoculars icon here. Your sort sequence, whichever column you've selected as your sort sequence, you can then click there to sort it ascending or descending by clicking your little icon at the bottom there. And then we also allow you to set up a filter. So you've already set up your date range, so it will only display the entries within that date range. But if you further want to filter the entries within that date range, you can then select a smaller date range within that date range by selecting the filter date range there, or you can select to only display unreconciled entries in that range, or only reconciled entries. Only entries that's reconciled in error, where your reconciliation amount is different to your Cashbook entry amount. It will then reconcile in error and give you a variance amount. You might only want to show those reconciled in error entries. Only your reversed entries. Only your partially posted entries. Those are entries where you've printed the check from batch entry. When you print the check from batch entry, it automatically becomes partially posted, because once you've printed a check, it becomes legal tender. And you cannot edit that information. So what Cashbook will do is, as soon as you print and accepted the check, it will then automatically update your bank reconciliation, but it will update it with a partially posted status. And you cannot reconcile that entry until you've gone to post the batch that partially posted entry belongs to, and then you'll be able to reverse or reconcile the entry. So if you only want to show the partially posted entries to see which checks have been printed and accepted but have not been posted as yet in the Cashbook batch, you can print the partially posted. And then if you want to filter by entry type, you might want to show only Cashbook entries, or only entries that's accounts payable entries, or only accounts receivable entries, or transaction types that only checks that have been printed, or deposits that have been printed, or only transfer entries that belong to transfer batches in the Cashbook. And you can also filter by amount, where you select a amount equal to, only entries that have that amount will then be displayed, or an amount greater than or equal to, an amount less than or equal to, or between two amounts. So you want to display all entries between two amounts. And you can then display only those entries by selecting the filter. If you then want to go back and show all the entries in your date range, you just hit the clear, and it will then clear the filter. So do remember that if they want to look for particular entries and only work with particular entries, they can definitely use that filter there, which will then filter within the date range the entries further. You can also display your Cashbook display. Now you can see at the moment we are displaying only our Cashbook display, and we sort it by reconcile amount. Let's sort by reference number again. So we're going to hit our sort here. So we sort by reference number, and we want to display our Cashbook display. So at the moment we've selected Cashbook there, and you can see it says Cashbook, so it will show you your Cashbook display, but you can also show your bank statement display. So if you select your bank statement display, it will show you your bank statement there. And the difference between your Cashbook and bank statement display is the same as the difference between your Cashbook report and your bank reconciliation report. The bank statement display will show you all the entries within your date range that you've selected, exactly the same as your Cashbook display, but any unreconciled entries before your starting date will also be displayed in your bank statement display. So you can see any entries that still have to be reconciled in the current period. Then you can show your bank statement display. History display, if you've reconciled your entries and you've cleared your reconciled entries to history, you can then select your history display, and your history display will then show you all the entries that when you selected to clear your reconciled transactions to history have been cleared to history. And in your history display, you can still do your search facilities and that to easily. You've got the same search facilities you do in your bank reconciliation in your history, so you can easily find any of your entries that have been updated to history. And then your last little icon there is your calculator icon once again. So once you've now reconciled all your entries and you're happy with your bank statement balance, then you would go to your Cashbook periodic processing, and if you so wish, because your posted transaction files get too big, you can then select to clear reconciled transactions to your history file. And in your clear Cashbook transactions, you can then select a particular bank code, range that you might want to clear for, and then a clear until date. And all reconciled entries up to that clear until date that you select here will then be cleared to the history file. Important thing to remember here is that clear until date, it defaults to the active start date of your entry. So remember our bank CTAC was the date range was from the 1st of October 2020 and to the 31st of October 2020. Therefore, it shows our active start date is the 1st of October 2020 and our clear until date will default to the 30th of September 2020. Your clear until date always has to be a date that does not fall within the date range selected in your Cashbook bank. In other words, if that clear until date is a date that is active, in other words, it is part of your date range that you've selected, you cannot then clear up to that date. Your clear until date always has to be 1 day before your starting date range in the bank reconciliation, because you can't clear entries to history that are reconciled that is in your current period that you're busy reconciling with. It's only when you completed the reconciliation for that period and you've changed your starting date to the start of the next month that you can then clear up to the beginning, to the end of the previous month. So just remember, your clear until date will automatically default to a day before your starting date. But if you choose, you can obviously change that clear until date as long as it always is a date before your start date in your bank range in the bank reconciliation. It will then clear all the reconciled transactions to history for you, and you can then display them in your history display in your bank reconciliation. Under audit lists and batches, you can then select here to print posting journals. You can clear your printed posting journals up to a particular sequence, clear your printed posting errors up to a particular sequence, and you can reset your posting sequence back to 1, you can see there. Or you can also clear your deleted and posted batches up to a certain batch if you don't want to display those batches anymore. And you can also, if you got to batch numbers that are very high and you want to reset it to batch number 1, you can then clear through to a particular batch ID and you can reset the batch numbers to 1. And then your printed registers, if you want to clear your check register, receipt register, or your retrieval errors register, you can then clear those registers here, and it will then clear those tables for you, so that when you print those reports, it will be only for the new entries that are populated to those tables since you ran the clear from here. Clear bank services. What the clear bank services will do for you is, if you want your entries in bank services that are all sitting there as outstanding, and this is only for accounts receivable and accounts payable entries, because remember, only your accounts receivable and accounts payable entries in Cashbook will be updated to bank services when you post your AR and AP batches in AP and AR. The Cashbook batches go straight through General Ledger. Now, if you've reconciled all those AP and AR entries in the Cashbook and you want to update your bank services to display those entries as cleared and not as outstanding. Because remember, in bank services, the terminology is slightly different. In Cashbook, it's unreconciled. In bank services, it's outstanding. In Cashbook, it's reconciled. In bank services, it is cleared. So if you want to update all your reconciled entries to reflect as cleared in bank services, then before you clear your bank reconciliation entries in Cashbook. So before you go to clear Cashbook transactions, that's important because remember, when you are running this, if you only want to clear it from the Cashbook, the posted Cashbook transaction file, then those reconciled entries must still sit in the Cashbook posted transaction file. If you clear them through history, then you can also select clear from history here, and it will then only clear the reconciled transactions in history and clear them in bank services, so they showed as cleared and not as outstanding. Now what it does is it will then also clear from date, clear to date. It will cycle through the Cashbook posted transaction file. It will find all the reconciled transactions up to this clear to date. It will then find those entries in bank services and it will change the status from outstanding to cleared, which brings your bank services reconciliation in line with your Cashbook. This might not be important to all Cashbook users. Some people just ignore the bank services because everything happens in Cashbook. But if they wish to update it like that, they can run it from here. Otherwise, they can just go into bank services and just run a clear for a range there and clear all the entries up to a certain date to be in sync with their Cashbook. Create GL batch, we've already been through, that's to transfer your entries to your general ledger. Under our analysis report, we've already been through our cashbook and our bank reconciliations report. You can also print a cashbook history report, and that will be all the entries with the same selections you get for your cashbook report of the entries that have been cleared to history when you run the clear cashbook transaction function. Source journals. Yeah, you can build your own reports with very, very powerful reports here. You can select your bank code, reference check, any of those fields. You can select the range, source code range, period range, date range, reference check range, and based on the statuses, only unreconciled, only reconciled, only reconciled, and only reversed. You can select to print totals, and yeah, you can build reports of any of your cashbook entries based on these ranges that you select according to these fields to print reports out of the cashbook. And then a cash flow report. Very good report to use as well if you want to have a cash flow analysis of any of your entries going through cashbook. So yeah, you can select your starting period, how many periods you want to print the cash flow report for. Then you can select your GL account range, and you can select to include your tax, include your history, include your GL budgets if you want to include your GL budgets, and then you can select to print in your bank currency or your source currency. And you can select for all your banks on or all your banks off. So if you switch them all off, you can switch on an individual bank. And this cash flow report will then print a report for you based on your GL account range that you've selected. And it will show you the movement for that particular general ledger account. So you can see there's the general ledger accounts on this side, and it will show you the opening balance, the inflow accounts. In other words, there were movement in these accounts, the total of the inflow for those accounts, and the outflow accounts. So inflow accounts, here we show movement, and it will show you any transactions for those GL accounts that have had an inflow or an outflow, and it will then show you all the entry movements for that particular GL accounts to show you what the cash flow movement was for those particular accounts. And then in the end, it will give you a closing balance as well. All those periods showing the movement for each GL account, cashbook entry movements going through that GL account for that particular period. Good, and that then concludes our cashbook training. So I'm just going to give you a moment to ask any questions if there are any questions.